Yes. So last year when I taught my advanced silviculture class, I co-taught it with the social scientists on that. We talked about this stuff. And some of my older colleagues just about ran me out of the building when they found out that the social scientist is teaching advanced silviculture. How can that be? So we've made some progress on that. I'll highlight a few things as we get along. So I'm going to get started since Christian talked a little longer. I'll probably just set the stage, and then after lunch we kind of talk a little bit. We get together and set the stage a little bit more for the exercise, so we get a little bit more into specifics. So Christian mentioned that I grew up in Germany on that, and I grew up about as conservative in forestry as you can.
Is it you there?
Yeah, I was walking around with a gun and a dog. You know, binoculars are always, it's hunting season any time in Germany. Yeah, we planting trees here. This is my parents' land. I could never plant straight enough, especially the stands you could see from the road down there, the main road that goes through town. On that, it was, you know, well regulated, even age stands. 92.7% Norway spruce. That pays the bills at home. And so I guess what you see now is I'm still fighting my childhood, you know, rebelling against my upbringing in some ways, but I don't know another way, but certainly in that sense started out with the very basics on that. Actually, this stand here, the main reason is this stand's left as a cabin in there that they like, so it's actually a recreational value that maintained the beach open. Okay. So I'm going to switch a little bit today. You know, Christian talked a lot about complexity, and I guess compared to 2 years ago, I really now look at what we're really after when we deal with complexity, and got to the point that it's really adaptability that we're after on that. And complexity to me is more of a tool that helps us get a handle on adaptability. So here's just one example how you can adapt, improvise, and overcome problems in the landscape. Plus, you know, I guess even for Canadians, you have soccer, right? Too, so you can appreciate that. Oops. So when I say, I really started thinking, what do we really want from forests on that? I know if I tell people what they really want, they of course rebel against that. But I think we've really mixed a few things in the past in terms of scales. At least I found when foresters think about how to manage the forest, what's their goal, it usually comes down, you want an even age stand, you want an uneven age stand. We focus a heck of a lot on structure, and we want certain dynamics and processes. But when we step back, what we really want is we're really after these goods and services. You know, we want the money, I guess, as landowners, we want the clean water as a city, we want the spiritual values, you know, the recreation values, and even, you know, think about some of the wilderness areas in the US. I'll never be able to go and hike and visit them all, but I feel good that they're there. So what we really want is at that ecosystem goods and services value. And so when we think about it, to me, we focused in on quite a lower level, a lower scale of management objectives on it. And if we step back and think about goods and services, that provides some different way of thinking and different options on that. Oops.
You like that picture, right?
Yeah, I really like that picture. So, but if we want really ecosystem goods and services, and this is really where we want stability in some ways on that. This is where we want continuity at that provision of goods and services on that. You know, stability is not a concept that we I guess, highlight anymore as much in ecosystems on that, but at the level of, you know, wanting water, wanting continuous employment or income, clean air, we want stability at that level still. And we can get that two ways. We can get that through robustness and we can get that through adaptability. Both of them. And in the past, at least in terms of forestry, we spent quite a bit of time thinking about robustness and how the historical range of variability, those kind of things. We spend a lot of time in terms of research and in terms of management focusing on that aspect. And we haven't spent enough time, at least in my opinion, thinking about adaptability. And of course, the fear of change is a big part of that. You know, that change makes people uncomfortable. That's just part of the nature of that. So we've focused on this resilience concept, resistance concept. I don't like to use the word resilience anymore. I try to minimize it. To me, it still can't shake that stability, you know, label on that. That's just inherent only by starting with the RE in front. You kind of have this backward looking, tying into that stability concept. You can't shake that. And then in terms of adaptability, I'll talk a little bit more about adaptive capacity and flexibility on that. And it's really the interplay of those kind of systems, and I'll spend a little time here on talking about social as well as environmental conditions. I'm no social scientist. I spend quite a bit of time obviously talking and working with them, especially when we develop the class. But it's really how these different factors interact in society and in ecosystems that allows us for sustainable provision. So it's if you think through this, it's quite a different view of looking at forest and forest management. In some ways, at least, that's what I'm hoping to do, or we're hoping to do the next 2 days here. You go back, you don't want to look at the forest the same way you did when you came here. And that's, so rather than, you know, worrying about changing the forest, it's really changing the forest. That's just as important, or maybe more important. And so going with that theme in terms of adaptability, when you think about it, you can provide it through society and through ecosystems on that. And this is, of course, the sales pitch for our first book. And as an example of that, you know, obviously, when we wrote that book, we focused on ecosystems. So if you think about it, if things don't go wrong, or if things go wrong in terms of providing, you know, timber income and stuff, what do? Well, we come in and we spray, or we cut, or do something like that. That means you have an input, you're putting money in it, you're putting energy in it, through society on that. We don't let the system deal with that on its own. On that. So a lot of the stability in the past has been provided by society on that. And, you know, forestry, let's face it, actually, you know, it's been successful. We have a lifestyle that we can afford that is only possible because there are some people pretty good at growing timber on that.
Have you read the Pathology of Command and Control that I think I distributed it?
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, and that's a big part of it is because as society, we have, well, made the input, but the second part, in the way society deals with this provision of goods and services, we've also accepted that the ecosystems change on that. Our expectation of what is a healthy forest has changed on that. We accepted that in many countries, we accept that species go down, at least in population size. In the US, certainly, we don't accept it, that they disappear. We have a law against that, so you're breaking the law. But, you know, what people accept as okay in the landscape has really changed, and that to me has been a societal adaptation to allow that provision of goods and services. And we haven't spent enough time thinking about if we can't do that, if society can't step in and fix or adjust, you know, what does the ecosystem do on its own? I mean, let's face it, you won't get any more money for forestry on that for silviculture intervention. I don't know about the Canadian agencies, but the budgets in the US go down, the companies are looking tired, you know, all investment trusts on that. You know, the public isn't looking the other way, they're actually looking closer and closer about what we do, and so we're getting a lot more public constraints, which tools we can use. You know, federal land, we basically cannot use herbicides unless it's an invasive species control. Clear-cut sizes, all those things have changed based on public view, and we learn a lot more about how the system interacts as a system. So we'll get less and less flexibility to help out with societal input to fix, so to speak, the ecosystem for that sustainable provision. And so that's really where I guess our efforts come in to think about it. What can we learn and how can we set up the ecosystem to do so? And that's really actually, you can look at it in another graph. I'm kind of like these visual things, the mind mapping and stuff, and you'll see some of that. But you can kind of look at it in another dimension as well, you know, where you have management options, where society has the ability to have input, and where you have low variability and low uncertainty, you can provide that income or that sustainable provision of goods and services can be achieved through management. This is fine. If you think about it, the hybrid cottonwood plantation, they're looking at a 10-year rotation. They're not worried about genetics being adapted to climate change, because every 10 years they can start over, and they will start over. Or in Douglas fir now, Otherwise, is talking about 35-year plantation. They're not worried too much about genetic adaptation. They're going to bring in the seed stock again, and they'll do that. And they're not so worried. I mean, they're worried, but they can also handle an insect coming in with their pesticide applications. So if you have that option to spend a lot of money, and you have a good handle on the uncertainty variability, which in many cases, at least the simplest way, is just to shorten your planting horizon or your harvest age in that sense, you can deal with that. The problem is where you don't have, well, both of those on that. So really the climate change problem will be in the wilderness areas, it will be in the areas we don't manage. Because we don't have, actually in wilderness areas in the US, it's illegal to run any motor in there. So if you want to cut a trail, you're with a hand saw on that, you can't really do anything. Even putting fires out in many places is a no-no. So where we don't have the management options, and of course where we think about longer term development, that's really where you have to think about the adaptive capacity of ecosystems. So when we talk about it, there's this of interest to companies, this whole variability discussion, to me it is, but they'll focus a lot more on the economics part of it. And for them, they have the same issue, but at different scales, and they have to look at adapting to markets and things like that. Based on my expertise and Christian's expertise, we focus on the ecosystems. So when we talk about adaptability on that, it comes into play really in the determination of how vulnerable is a system to changes from the outside. And it could be climate change, it could be changing politics, it could be new insect disease coming in. And it's kind of correlated in terms of how sensitive the system is, and how exposed it is, and of course the higher the adaptive capacity, the less vulnerable the system is, and I'll explain some of those concepts in a little more detail. But what I want to, I guess I'll maybe at least go through this one. So if you think about it, if you look at ecosystems, you can align them across environmental factors, and actually after sitting there this morning, I should change this, maybe this one a social factor. But you have different environmental factors, and there is a kind of a range that the ecosystems can survive in, so to speak, or maintain themselves inactive. In this case, I just put one down here, and if changes happen, whoops, actually, and within those so-called fundamental niche, there is a subset of that that's socially acceptable. For example, the species could disappear in the system, it still would function, but we decided as a society we don't want that to happen. Or if you deal with a timber company, you want your 6%, 8% interest, and that limits you to the options where you're going to see the forest managed on that. Make sense? So what happens when we have disturbances, there's a number of possible pathways the system can take. Some of them will move it further away, and some of them keep it close, and the thicker the line, the more likely it is that the pathway will be taken. Yes, and I kept them linear based on that, I guess. So these are just the endpoints. And yeah, they could kind of morph through there. But the system will change in some ways, and really what it points out is, as Christian already set the stage, things will change whether we like it or not. And the point is, can we deal with the change to maintain them in what we consider socially acceptable. So in terms of conservation, to maintain the species that we have, for example, on that. Again, if you look at it as an economic thing, to have a certain income, coming out every year. On that. So what we really want to do in terms of management is kind of increase the pathways and increase the likelihood that those pathways are taken, so they can take a line that keep the system inside that socially acceptable conditions. And if you think about it from in a company point of view, it would kind of be capacity building, I guess we call it. So we want to think about setting up the ecosystem that when change comes, the perturbation either could be a big disturbance, a new insect, a new disease, a change in policy, climate change on that.
Could we say that the range of acceptable condition is dependent on the adaptive capacity of the society, what they can adapt to, and that also can be modified, perhaps?
Yes, on that. Actually, that's really when it comes in. One of the ways how we dealt with that is lose our social constraints. That means, you know, in terms of policies or economic expectations, we can manage it. We can tighten it on that with some regulations, and we can loosen the societal expectations with regulations or public expectations. You know, there's subsidies for certain mills, things like that that come into play. There are various ways how to manage that. But yes, you're right, of course. We, you know, for a social science group, we'd have to change that socially acceptable scope there as well. And I guess we have a good point. So for management though, I guess maybe I'll stick with the social constraints. In terms of silviculture, the options we have, you find out we have a lot more flexibility here if we meet our production goals. If I know I make my income, then suddenly I can do something else on top on that. So if you're efficient at producing what the main production goal is, you know, once I find that in terms of management, you know, I'm dealing a lot with studies about morphing even-aged monocultures into, you know, late succession of old growth type structures. Once the trees are harvestable size, foresters are interested in doing something because it means they get money. That gives them the flexibility to do that. Before the trees are harvestable size, I can't convince people to go in and spend money. So that's what I mean with this one. The second one is the low intensity of management. You have more options. You know, of course, once you vested yourself into a certain management goal, you know, you have the upfront investment, it's locked in. Because your shareholders are looking over your shoulder, you're limited in what you can do on that. And really what you see here is that those kind of, I'll get into that in a few minutes, maybe after lunch. A lot, you know, the high intensity management is really usually setting things up that the system is really well adapted to current conditions. You want to maximize the efficiency to produce what you're after under the current setting. And there's a trade-off in terms of if you do that, you lose some ability to set the system up to be adaptable for the future. There's some trade-offs to think of. Then, of course, as pointed out before, there's a lot we can do, a lot we've done in the past by changing laws and policies, public expectation, public education, things like that. That you know, you can, and that's one of the dangers I find with focusing on adaptability and talking about change not as something bad, is that people say, well, then everything goes, right? If I make it everything acceptable, then my socially acceptable part of the graph will be basically filling out the fundamental niche, and everything goes. So we got to be careful how we deal with that. Maybe one more.
You can continue a few minutes.
Yeah, maybe I'll just get to the point where we bring up the complexity into it.
The panarchy, you mean?
No. I have a few other things.
Okay.
So when you look at adaptability of systems, and specifically ecosystems, what I want to point out, they can adapt at various scales and hierarchical levels. Changes are going on. And that's really, to me, actually one of the reasons why I ended up in the idea of complex adaptive system. Here are some examples. You know, if things change in an ecosystem, you'll see some stuff down from the gene pool diversity, the DNA sequences will change, of course. At the same time, if you look at organisms, you know, the number of organs, you know, size of trees or size of animals will change on that. They will adapt to conditions on that. Maybe the behavior will change. If you get different hunting pressure, they'll change on that. So there is some change going on in terms of organisms. You go into populations, you have things like, you know, birth rates, death rates, growth patterns. All those things will change as in response to some disturbances on that, or perturbation changes, I guess, in that sense. You could also have, I guess, in terms of population, to bring humans in, the cultural ability, that the culture aspects will change as well. And then you have at the top level, you know, and the biota level, things like species, migration, species extinction, new invasive species that will change as well. And so when we think about it, how ecosystems change and therefore adapt to new conditions, all of these is going to happen at the same time, likely, on that. And that's really, you know, a tough one to manage, especially, you know, they're not independent. So what happens here at the DNA sequence may determine whether a species will become extinct or not, or can invade or not. So all these things are linked, and of course the tighter the link they are, the more, you know, those things interact on that. And in terms of thinking about how to manage those kind of systems with all the different hierarchical levels, that's really actually, to me, where complexity and complex adaptive systems science comes in. It helps us trying to make sense out of all these possible interactions in there that otherwise are just, at least for me, you know, very tough to get a handle on. And so that's what we're going to do this afternoon. Yeah, I'm going to cut into lunch more since Christian went way over. I should have known that. But that's really actually when we're kind of trying to take this and helping or looking for this complex systems theory to help us make sense out of how these different hierarchical levels interact and how we can think about manipulating the forest, that the development after disturbance, after change, stays within desirable or acceptable range of conditions.
So that will be the exercise we will do. We'll go in the forest, you will look at it, bring back here and then discuss this afternoon, tonight, tomorrow morning, and you have a few exercises and we'll develop an approach that deals with these complex adaptive systems.
Yeah, so there's various theories and so-called archetype models. People have thought about models that are quite useful in letting you look at the forest on that, and that's what we're going to go through where we apply those theories.
So you have 60 more slides.
No, there's some extras at the end that
Phew.
I think I was at 37 when I came in, and then added one more.
Okay.
But I guess it's...
So you think it's a good time to break?
Yeah, let's do that.
Is there any questions before lunch?